You're listening to the Just Japan podcast. Everything you want to know about Japan.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Just Japan podcast. That's right, it's time for another episode. My name is Kevin O'Shea, and I am your host on this podcast about all things Japan. And I've got another fantastic episode for you. Another first-time guest joining us here on the podcast for episode 222. With me this week is Rochelle Kopp from Japan Intercultural Consulting. That's right. And Rochelle is someone who I have seen on Twitter for a very long time, over the course of many years. And she is always posting very fascinating things about running a business or doing business-oriented things in Tokyo. But actually, there's a lot of facets to Rochelle. And the reason why she's on this specific episode is to talk about her activism. Now, you know what? I got to get her back on in the future to talk about her work that she does with intercultural consulting. But in this episode, we're going to be talking all about the work that Rochelle has been doing to save trees and parks in Tokyo and across Japan, but specifically Tokyo, where she is based. And it was a very fascinating conversation for me. I definitely learned a lot about what she's doing, about the really terrible things that are going on with trees right now, the state of the environment, or the poor state of the environment in Tokyo. And it was a very great conversation. So we are back. It's the summertime. So I'm kind of on a more regular schedule with putting out the podcast. Last week, I chatted with Brian Waters all about his children going through the entire Japanese school system, and that was a fantastic conversation. But you know what? Let's just jump into our conversation with Rochelle Kopp about activism and saving trees in Tokyo. Well, everyone, welcome to another episode of the Just Japan podcast and the Nature Talks podcast. This is an interview that's very special today that will be in both of my podcasts. And today I would like to welcome first-time guest that I'm very happy to have on the show, Rochelle Kopp. Thank you for coming on the podcast. Glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Awesome. Now, I've been following you on Twitter for many years now. I'm a big Twitter fan, have been for a long time. Don't like calling it X. I still like to call it Twitter. And again, I've been on it for years, and a lot of the people I've made connections with over the years have been through Twitter. A lot of the guests from the previous episodes of the podcast. And I know I followed you and learned a lot about your work with businesses. I subscribed to your newsletter and my email and all this stuff. But it wasn't until a few years ago when I came across an episode of JJ Walsh's Seek Sustainable Japan podcast, where I heard you come on and you were talking a lot about trees. And I was like, whoa, wait a second. I always do stop and listen to Joy's podcast. I love it. Love what she does. And but before we get too far into that, I was wondering if you could tell the listeners just a little bit about yourself, where you're based in Japan.
Certainly. So I'm in Tokyo, and I'm in the eastern half of the city, or a part of the city, and I'm near Ningyo-cho, so kind of a more traditional area.
Okay. All right. And what do you do in Japan?
So I am a management consultant. I have my own firm, and in fact, last week was the 30th anniversary of our firm's founding.
Oh, wow.
My firm's founding. Thanks. So I've been doing this for a while, and I've been going back and forth between Japan and the U.S., this whole 30 years that I've had my firm, working with Japanese companies that have global operations.
Okay.
And global firms that have operations in Japan, doing cross-cultural training, leadership training, executive coaching, team building, all those types of sort of soft skills related organization development activities.
Wow, that's fantastic. Obviously, such important things to have when you're working internationally. I'm not a business owner myself, but I've been an international school teacher since 2002, and I've worked in Korea, Japan, China, and now I'm in Malaysia. And if there's one thing I've learned over the years is it's always very important to know how to tread when you're speaking at meetings and trying to push through things that you want and advocate for. Even as a teacher, the different kind of maybe programs or initiatives I want in a school, I have to learn how to speak and how to speak carefully and do things the right way if I want to make sure I get the outcome I'm looking for. And a lot of that has to do with all that cultural piece, obviously, right? But as people will see in the title, we're talking about activism and tree conservation in Tokyo, and I guess we're going to get more into that shortly. But I know that you are, you do have a background in environmental activism, and you care deeply about trees and whatnot, and different aspects in the parks of Tokyo. So I'm wondering, can you tell us a little bit about your story with how you got involved with environmental activism and that connection you have with it?
Certainly. So actually, my first environmental activism activity goes back to 1989 or 90, so a very long time ago. So this was my first time living in Japan, and I was working in a Japanese bank at their headquarters doing international public relations for them. Wow. And I was their first person who was disseminating information about the bank in English. Oh, wow. So this was early days for them being a global company. And one of my friends, she had gone to a talk by a woman named Elizabeth Kiritani, who is an American woman who had lived in Tokyo for a long time. I'm assuming she's still here. I haven't been in touch with her, but she lives near Ueno Park and had given a talk to a group that my friend had gone to about a plan to build a underground parking lot underneath Shinobazu Pond in Ueno. Okay. And so all of you have been to Ueno Park. There's this giant, it's like a lake really, and it's full of these giant water lilies with the huge petals or I should say lily pad leaves. Yeah. It is very beautiful. They were going to put a parking lot underneath that, which, of course, building that kind of structure underneath a lake like that would just likely destroy the habitat. Yeah. And my friend wanted to try and help with this effort. The community was against it, and Elizabeth was part of that community effort. And my friend said, "Hey, Rochelle, you're in PR. Do you have any idea for a way that we could maybe get the word about this out to some journalists and get some attention on this just crazy, destructive plan?" And I said, sure. And I thought about it from my PR perspective. What journalists would be interested in this topic? Where does it intersect with their interest? Yeah. And I thought to contact, there was a gentleman who had a regular column in the Japan Times at the time about wild birds in Japan, kind of a bird watching type. And he's written books about the birds of Japan. You can look them up on Amazon. Mm-hmm. And I found his contact information. I wrote to him and I said, you're interested in birds. There are a lot of wild birds that use Shinobazu Pond as a stopping point or a resting point or a place to nest, etc. And this project looks like it's going to completely ruin the pond. And I wrote him about it, and he was absolutely horrified. And he wrote a full page, one of his columns, devoted to this topic. And so it was literally a full page in the Japan Times. Oh, wow. With a big picture of Shinobazu Pond and his ranting and raving about how absolutely crazy this is and how bad it would be for the birds. Mm. And there were lots of efforts at this time to try to stop this project. So I'm not going to say that this was the only thing that stopped it. However, pretty soon after this column ran, the project was scuttled. Oh, wow. Yes. And so that was sort of my first taste of, hey, maybe I could do something to help call attention to something that's problematic.
Yeah.
So that was a very long time ago, but that was sort of how I got into doing this. And, there have been over the years a couple other things that I did while living in the U.S., because I've been kind of going back and forth between sometimes living in the U.S. and sometimes living in Japan. And I had a couple things in the U.S. where, again, raising my voice was effective. And one was a plan for my neighborhood in Chicago that I was living in at the time to build a giant movie theater in a place that was really inappropriate for it, and to not have enough parking as part of the theater, so the cars would overrun a small, quiet neighborhood. It's going to be across the street from a school, which you're not supposed to have movie theaters right next to schools because you don't want the kids playing hooky and going to see the movies. And the real estate developer had some sort of sweetheart deal with the alderman, and so he was backing the project. And a bunch of my neighbors and I, there was some explanation meeting in the neighborhood, and we said, this is just insane. And we banded together, and I basically took a week off of work and helped with this project to, get the press looking at it, look at the legal angles, et cetera. And I was just one of a group of people, but then the alderman called me, maybe because I was home during the day, because, I worked for myself, and so I was around. And the alderman called me up and said, you win. Now, if you know anything about Chicago politics and crooked aldermen, there are not many people walking the face of this earth where Chicago alderman has told them, you win.
Wow.
So this is like a feather in my cap.
Yeah.
And so they built the movie theater in a much more appropriate place where it wasn't overrunning a small neighborhood. And it was, anyway, so that was maybe like 20 years ago. So, and then another thing that happened more recently, my base in the US has been in Silicon Valley. And there was a green space that everyone thought was part of a park.
Okay.
But because it was next to a park and we just thought it was part of it. But actually, it turns out there was a landowner, and he came up with a plan to build a bunch of houses on it. And the problem was it was in I won't bore you with the details, but it was in a very unsafe location for flooding and fire protection, that it really made no sense to build houses there. It would have been actually quite dangerous for the inhabitants and also for fire personnel if there were a fire. And it also would have obliterated, a lovely green space. And so my husband and I got involved in the environmental process. And there's an environmental assessment process. And as part of the scoping, where they ask community members for their input, and we put together. I have to admit, it was mostly my husband who did it. He should have been a lawyer, but he wasn't. But he's very good at writing these detailed things. And I don't know, 20 pages of pointing out problems with the plan, and we got 100 of our neighbors to sign it. And eventually, the landowner was like, "Oh, this is going to be more trouble."
He also said, "You win, really, you win."
And basically, we won. And what he did is, I think he realized, it really was going to be very dangerous for it wasn't a safe place to put houses. And so he ended up giving the land to the county as a park, and so then it did become a park. Which
nice.
Yeah, so it worked out. So I'd had some experiences in the past, okay?
Nice,
so, and again, this is just something that like every 10 years ago or 15 years or so came up, because it's, these are like a few examples over the last, over 30 years. So, so anyways, I'd had some experiences. And then, like you, I am very much into Twitter, and I have an English account, and I also have a Japanese account where I follow what Japanese people are tweeting about. Okay. And actually before I got involved with the Jingu Gaien project that I've been working on now, there was a previous one, a smaller issue right before the Olympics, that I had seen on Twitter that there was a plan to build a public viewing facility in Yoyogi Park.
Oh, yeah. I remember hearing you talk to Joy about this from your podcast from a few years ago.
Yeah. And so, a public viewing facility is a giant screen. And so it's designed for people who can't actually get into the venue to have a place to come and have a beer and watch the game on the giant screen. And in normal times, people tell me that it's really quite fun to have something like that. However, the Olympics in Tokyo in 2021 were not normal times. It was the middle of a pandemic and everyone was supposed to be staying home. So why were we spending public funds to build a facility designed to gather literally thousands of people at a time when everyone should be staying home? Kind of doesn't make sense. And the nature lover in me got very concerned because the way I found out about it is someone had tweeted pictures of the signs that were up in Yoyogi Park saying that they were going to cut all the branches off the trees up to, I think, like 3 or 4 meters or 8 meters or some like pretty high level, so that the trees would lose a lot of their branches. I'm like, why are we disfiguring trees for something that's a temporary thing? And I thought that was a really bad idea. And I thought, well, this seems like kind of an obscure thing. Maybe not many people care about disfiguring trees, and maybe not that many people care about this public viewing, but I think it's incredibly stupid. And at the time, Kenji Utsunomiya, who was a candidate for mayor, he put together a change.org petition to stop the Olympics. And it had gotten a huge number of signatures. It was kind of a talk of the town. And I thought, oh, well, this means the Japanese like change.org petitions, or that they're okay with that as a format, or they welcome that as a format. And I thought, why don't I make a change.org petition about this and see what happens? I spent the next week being interviewed on TV. I couldn't get any work done.
Oh, wow.
And we got 150,000 signatures. People went bananas because I think what it was I think people were really, really, really not happy that the Olympics were going forward. Yeah. I think a lot of people in Tokyo felt it was just kind of forced on them. And people were like, okay, we can't stop the Olympics. Can we at least not do this stupid thing? And it got a lot of attention. And Governor Koike, the thing she hates most is negative attention. And so when it got so bad that Dave Spector made a joke about it, that he said it's not public viewing, it's public booing. Everyone was so upset as public viewing. Booing, he said. But if Dave Spector's making a joke about it, all these shows, were
all the talento were making jokes on TV.
Yes, and that's the thing that Koike hates most because she's very image oriented. And so she said, well, okay, we're not going to do the public viewing. We're still going to build the facilities because we want to pay our friends, the construction companies, and we're going to use it as a vaccination venue.
Okay.
For firemen and police. So no one can, a cause that no one can complain about. And they did have to cut some of the branches off, but an Asahi Shimbun reporter got someone from the city on record saying that they cut fewer branches than they were originally planned to, and they did the bare minimum because they knew everyone was watching. So that was good. So that was kind of a success. And then 7 or so months after that, I saw the notice about the Jingu Gaien redevelopment project having been passed by the Planning Commission.
Okay.
But at the same time, a professor had studied the plans and said that about 1,000 trees would have to be cut down to build it. And I thought, well, this sounds really bad. And it was, approved without any debate. And I tweeted on my Japanese feed because now a lot of people who are interested in trees and government and things like that were following me. And I said, this plan looks really bad. Maybe I should do another petition. Everyone said, yes, do another petition. So that's how I ended up doing a petition calling for the reexamination of this development project. Now, myself and the other activists.
I'm sorry, just to backtrack, just for those who may not know.
Right.
What is that area, the Jingu Gaien?
Yeah, let me explain it.
Yeah, for those who may not. Yeah.
Right. So this is Jingu Gaien. It is in the middle of Tokyo. It is at Gaien Mai Station on the Ginza line.
Okay.
And it is famous for it's the location of the Jingu Stadium, where the Yakult Swallows play. one of Japan's oldest baseball stadiums, one of the few remaining stadiums where Babe Ruth had played.
Oh, wow.
There is the Chichibu-nomiya Rugby Stadium there. It's right next to the new National Stadium that was built for the Olympics. There is in this area famous rows of ginkgo trees that are very, very well known, and there are cafes and restaurants next to the rows of ginkgo trees, very popular tourist spot. There are softball fields. There was a second baseball stadium, which was also a golf practice area, but that's been torn down as the first part of this project. There are tennis courts. There are batting range. There was a futsal court that was taken away. There is an ice skating rink.
Okay, well,
there was a popular pool, but that got turned into a hotel as part of the Olympics. So the area is already, part of it has already been changed because of the Olympics. But it's right in the center of Tokyo, and it's was Japan's first landscape preservation area.
Oh, okay.
So for many years there were restrictions on how high you could build, and restrictions on doing any development, but also restrictions on building height.
Well, and now people want to develop it. They want to build buildings there and tear these things down and rip out 1,000 trees. And what's happening with that development?
Okay, so this development so far, it passed through the planning commission. Koike gave her initial approval. Despite our petition already having tens of thousands of signatures at that point. So that was in 2022. Throughout 2022, went through the environmental assessment process, which was an absolute farce. Because what happened was the members of the committee, were taking very seriously their role, and there are huge issues with this development. But it started to take a long time because they're asking too many questions. So the city kind of rushed them. And even when on the day in early 2023, when the head of the assessment committee said, we don't think we're at a point where we can give this a green light, the city went ahead and approved it anyways.
Wow.
So they're just ignoring their environmental assessment. Then what happened is sort of right after that, in spring of 2023, the world-renowned musician Ryuichi Sakamoto, who was battling cancer, wrote a letter to Governor Koike and other politicians involved, asking for the plan to be revised and concerned about the environmental destruction and the lack of community input. And so calling on her to, rethink this plan. And Koike issued a very cold response. She's like, well, why doesn't he write to Meiji Jingu instead? Kind of this has nothing to do with me, despite the fact she's the person who approved it. Yeah. And then he was battling cancer, as I said, and then he died a week and a half later. And so, while it was, kind of obnoxious the way she kind of brushed him off, the fact she did that was a beloved person who was on their deathbed was really fairly cold. Yeah. But also what happened is that this then drew a lot of attention to the project, and his fans said, well, this was his dying wish. This was he had been very active in environmental and social causes, and he had actually started a nonprofit to plant trees. So this was, a very sincere interest of his. Yeah. And people said this was his dying wish. And so that got a lot more attention and led to other celebrities speaking up. It led to one of Japan's most beloved rock groups writing a song about Jingu Gayan. Oh, wow. And it got international attention. So the International Committee on Monuments and Sites issued a heritage alert for an area that is in danger. So, and they don't do that very often. So there's been a lot of concern raised about the project, both domestically and internationally, and concern about how many trees are being cut down. But also, there's been a lot of concern centered on the way that the approval process happened, and the basically it's very complicated. But basically, to make this happen, they had to erase the zoning restrictions and the landscape preservation area rules, some of which they did in secret. So like, what's the point of having like a zoning if you can just like, oh, it's not convenient for us anymore. And they had put in they made a new scheme that basically enables even higher buildings.
Okay.
And also then there was this whole, complete lack of robustness of the environmental assessment process. So the Japan Federation of Bar Associations and the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights and the Japan chapter of the International Association of Impact Assessment Professionals have all spoken out about the process and how problematic it is. And so in my mind, it's an environmental issue, but it's also a proper government issue.
Yeah. Wow. A lot of layers, and
it's very complicated. Yes.
Yeah. No, but I mean, it's really interesting. Some of the things I'm hearing, and I guess with regard to that, and there's those those rules that are maybe being skirted or changed in order to benefit certain people. But what I'm wondering, and I leave myself scratching my head a lot, is when it comes to, for example, one of the most pressing issues in the world right now, obviously people talking about climate change, climate action. I spent a lot of time working, I'm an international school educator, an environmental educator. I just was excited to be accepted into a program, a sustainable education program, where I'm going to be getting more training to bring SDGs into schools and embed them into curriculum, which is like a really key thing.
Nice.
And this is kind of, yeah. Well, thank you. And it's my wife is from Osaka. I spent, 10 years living in Kobe, Osaka. And I have, so many dear family and friends who are in Japan. I'm very connected to the country. And you just hear this kind of anecdotal news. Well, it's not even anecdotal. You hear the news, literal around the world, how, everything's getting hotter. Cities are getting hotter. These major urban areas like Tokyo, like Osaka. Like I live in Malaysia. I live in that's jungle out that window. And yet it's hotter in Osaka and Tokyo now than it is here where I'm at. And that just seems so wrong in so many ways. And, obviously we know we need trees. If you talk to any 7-year-old who I teach grade 2, they will all they can tell you about, that trees clean the air, trees take carbon out of the air, trees put oxygen in the air, trees are habitats for animals, and they give us shade. The kids, like 7-year-olds know this stuff.
And they stabilize the soil and they absorb groundwater. Yes.
They do so many things, right? So what, and I one of the talking points I sent to you was one thing I keep hearing is that not just Tokyo, but it seems like a lot of municipalities around Japan are waging war against trees.
They are. It's horrible.
And big trees, like the most important ones that we need the most and that do the most. And that seems to just kind of, it's counter to everything that we are learning and know and are trying to teach children about in schools and to educate people about. What's going on? That's a big question.
Okay.
What the hell's going on here?
Yeah, I know. It is really kind of absolutely crazy, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's also, there's so many different ways I can answer your question. And one thing I'll just mention is I feel like it's particularly shocking because I think one of the things that people from outside of Japan think about when they think about Japan is nature and trees and the love that Japanese have for nature.
Yeah.
And so the way that trees are being treated in Japanese cities is absolutely counter to that.
Yeah.
So it sort of raises some questions, and I've heard Japanese experts talk about, well, what's really happening to us as a society that we don't care about trees anymore? Yeah. I think one answer is that you just mentioned all the wonderful things that trees do that your 7-year-old students are aware of.
Yeah.
Very sadly, very few people in Japan are aware of those benefits of trees. And if you, for example, Google in English value of urban trees, you will find tremendous amounts of information.
Okay.
And various different academic studies and papers. And I've even seen ones where, one tree, the environmental services, as they call it, that a tree gives in terms of, sequestering CO2 or absorbing pollution, et cetera. I've even seen dollar figures put onto it. But in Japan, if you Google in Japanese, Toshi Jumoku no Kachi, which is value of urban trees, hardly find anything. It's just not something that people are aware of at all. Okay. And they're also not aware of one of the key words that's getting a lot of attention recently around the world is this concept of canopy cover. Mm-hmm. So how much does the canopy of the trees cover? Mm-hmm. And that's a really good measure for the positive impacts of the trees that you have. So for example, New York City, they're famous for they planted 1 million trees and then they decided to plant another 1 million trees. And that's not even enough. They've decided, well, it's not just the number of trees, it's the canopy cover. Canopy cover is currently 22% in New York City, and they're going to take it up to 30%.
Well, and that's the amazing thing. Like just, having a conversation the other day out for a walk with my wife, who is from Osaka, again, like I mentioned, and I was telling her that I was going to be talking to you, and I was explaining kind of the topic of this podcast and what you advocate for and what you're an activist for. And even she's just like scratching her head. She's like, what's going on here? Even like she would say, well, we gave a comparison where I had until this year, or previous to this year, I was living in Shenzhen, China, next to Hong Kong. And we talked, it's a subtropical climate. It's a really hot place. And, but the area where we lived, although in the city, the streets were lined with massive trees with huge canopy cover. And my wife was talking about that even like when we were out for walks, it felt so much cooler because we were always in the shade. Whereas when you're in downtown Osaka, like no matter where it is in downtown Osaka, aside from Osaka Castle Park, you're baking and cooking.
You're absolutely baking. Well, the thing is, there's no shade. Also, trees, in addition to providing shade, they actually act as like an air conditioner and they cool around them. And it's part of the respiratory factor that they do with that water. But it is like a kind of like an air conditioner. Yeah. So, and yes, I had something last summer. I had a client and it was out in the Tokyo western suburbs. And I looked on the map and they're 15 minutes from the station, 15-minute walk. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, okay, well, fine. I'm just going to go out there and I'll walk. There was a hot day, bright sun, and I was going there like at noon. And literally for this entire 15-minute walk, there was literally not one tree.
Yeah.
And I got to the climb and I was just really not in particularly good shape because it was like, the broiling heat and, you're just thinking the glare. I mean, it's just so terrible. I mean, the thing is there's a lot of layers on this. For example, cities not planting trees, not having tree-lined streets. There's no requirement in Japan for having a certain setback between your street and the house or a certain percentage of your property devoted to green area. So it's very, very common to have, for example, buildings that go exactly to the property line. And so that leaves no room for green space. There's no requirements on that. There's no, in a lot of other places in the world, there are restrictions on cutting down existing trees when you redevelop a property. And there are no such restrictions in Japan. And so there's definitely a view of trees as disposable. And there's nothing that formally recognizes their value. Yeah. And so you've got not enough parks in places like Osaka and Tokyo. Yeah. And then you have people's trees are being lost as, for example, you might have elderly couple had a house with a garden and a tree. They pass away, their descendants get the house because inheritance taxes are very high and have to be paid in cash. A lot of times the descendants have to sell the house. They sell the house is bought by developers raise the garden, raise the house, raise the trees, and then they build a condominium building that completely fills the square footage of that space. So the suburban areas of Tokyo are losing all of their greenery that way.
Oh, wow.
There is pressure on shrines financially, and so they're giving up part of their space to developers to put condominiums on them, which again, you lose trees.
Yeah.
So the Jingu-gyan one is kind of that same issue, kind of writ large. So there's all these issues. The other one is with street trees, that a lot of times in Japan, they are pruned so that they don't have canopy cover and they look like a telephone pole with a little bit of green. And so then there's a lot of reasons behind that. There's not wanting to spend money raking the leaves. So let's just have no leaves fall. There's also this kind of extreme risk averseness of, we've got a tree and it has branches. What if a branch falls on someone? It's going to be someone's fault. They'll have to take responsibility. So let's just get rid of the branches. And, it's kind of like that. Then in Osaka, they're cutting down tens of thousands of trees in parks, and including ones that look perfectly safe. And they're like, it's like they're making up excuses to cut them down. It's absolutely insane. There's a citizens group that's trying to fight it, and the city won't give logical reasons for cutting some of these trees. And it's like, it's our prerogative. We're cutting them. And with no thought at all to, heat island or global warming or anything. It's just very, very strange what's happening.
Wow, that's so frustrating on so many levels. And I mean, again, it's just for me as someone who spends all of my time like thinking about this stuff and teaching it to children and running workshops with my colleagues and doing assemblies with children and teaching again all this stuff. It's interesting because I've worked at international schools around Asia, and maybe because it is something that we're now with international schools, a lot of schools are trying to embed the Sustainable Development Goals into curriculum. And we realize that the only way to make it meaningful and lasting is to have it in the curriculum, so teachers are accountable. Like they must teach these things. We can always have like an Earth Day and say we should, that's something I've talked about over the years at schools I've worked at, where you have an Earth Day and for one day a year it's beautiful.
Right.
But when you embed that into a curriculum and make teachers accountable for teaching it, then it's like Earth Day all the time. But I'm really, I guess, surprised and maybe not surprised at the same time when I hear this about how you said it's just not in the mind of Japanese people in general, because it's maybe just something that's not taught to them. I mean, that's like the concept of ignorance. It's, I lived in Beijing years ago. And, I would talk to my colleague. Obviously, you can be sometimes careful about the way you talk about things and when you're in China. But I'd ask my Chinese colleagues just, in conversation, like the AQI is so high. The air is so bad. We, for example, as foreigners, like I know this. I'm aware that the AQI is 600. And I know that when I taught at the Canadian International School of Beijing, we would have to keep all the doors closed because we had a giant internal HEPA filter system. And there'd be all these warning signs like, don't open the doors, don't do this. But you look across the road and that office building has got all their windows wide open. And like my colleagues would just say, like, they literally just don't know because they're not taught, and they're intentionally not taught in that case, but they literally just don't know.
They don't have the basis of comparison. Yeah. And I think with the value of urban trees, again, people don't know, they're not taught. And then also I see this is, I guess you can say in a way, it's an example of information from other places not coming into Japan. So this idea of the trees being valuable and a key in a city's environmental strategy, that's become really common around the world. But somehow Japan is not good at importing those ideas. And even on a micro level, one thing that I have people keep coming up, obnoxious responders on Twitter like, it's better to cut down those old trees because the young trees, they'll absorb more CO2. And actually that was the belief until 10 years ago. And then there were studies that showed that the larger, older trees absorb more CO2. And fortunately, someone wrote an article about that and said, the orthodox belief has been put on its head, and actually older trees absorb more CO2. I can't tell you the number of people that I share that article with. I'm like, your information is 10 years out of date.
Yeah.
And even the developers, they talk about Midori no Koshin. Well, we're gonna renew the greenery by taking down those old trees and putting in new ones. I'm like, that's so bad for the environment. And they're talking about it like it's a good thing, because again, the current information hasn't come into Japan.
And they don't obviously have any concept of what an ecosystem is and how everything is linked together. When you remove one thing, you destroy all the other things. And
exactly, that's not something that's, again, there hasn't been enough education about it, and people aren't aware, and the law doesn't really support thinking about it. It's very frustrating.
So I'm wondering then, I'm just jumping ahead. I don't want to keep you too long. And I realize it's the middle of the day there. Well, here too. But one of the things that I often talk about with children and and adults like as well, because often what I find myself doing when I'm trying to kind of like bridge that nature disconnect with children, as I often learned, like when I was living in Shenzhen and working there, I need to get to the parents as well too. I need to really educate those parents, because if parents aren't willing to take their children outside, then where do I start? I can tell kids you need to be outside. And they're like, yeah, I know, but my mom won't take me, and I live in the big city and I can't go out on my own. Right. So, often I'd have to educate parents about the importance, and I'd hold workshops where I'd take parents to parks and teach them about local ecosystems. And I'd do a little birding with them and teach them about local bugs and flowers and the importance of it all. And my hope was, if I can get the parent, and I would always get the parents excited. It was always amazing, right? I'd be like, look up on that tree. Those are fruit bats. And I'd see parents be like, oh my God, those are bats. Wow. And they were more excited than the kids. And I'm wondering, because again, so I'm always talking about we use the term taking action. I think it's kind of an international baccalaureate kind of inquiry learning term, taking action. And I tell kids that small actions are so meaningful, because if we all take small actions, they build up, and they build up into bigger actions. So what would you say, for those who are listening right now, who are getting pissed off and who are like pulling out their hair and saying, why, what are some things that, like, for example, the foreign residents of Japan, or, if they're Japanese listeners, I know I do have some who are listening, or those who are not in Japan, like me at the moment, but still connected to Japan, have a love of Japan. What are some things that people can do in order to try to bring a bit of this knowledge in or help?
Right. Well, I think one thing is, please sign my petition.
Okay.
That would be very helpful.
Okay, well, you send me that link. I'll make sure it's in the show notes, and I'll put it all over
I will send you the link. Thank you.
And I'll share it all over my social media as well. So you hear that, folks. Okay, there's the first step.
Well, that's the other thing is to please share on social media. So share the link to the petition, share information about trees. Just talk about these issues. I think it's very, very important. And there are, for example, there's a bunch of non-Japanese who have talked on Twitter about, hey, the trees are being cut down around me, and there aren't any trees in my area. And so I think people are talking about some of these problems, and I think that's really important. And, again, to talk about it with the people around you.
Nice. I guess, too, if we could get more of Japanese people talking about, or people, who are not Japanese, but can have the ability to share in Japanese. I think
that's helpful too. Yes.
Because I'm seeing more of a, like, one thing I've noticed over the years, like when I was living in Kobe, I guess partway through my time, the kind of what's the term I'm looking for? The eat local kind of thing started happening more, and the whole farm to table was happening more. And the Kobe government created the Eat Local Kobe, or helped start that up. And there was like a lot of farmers markets growing, and a lot of I think schemes to help promote urban agriculture and to get more young people into agriculture. Obviously, that's a huge need, right?
Right.
And what I've noticed, because I follow a lot of these people on Instagram, like, what I always tell people is I go to like Eat Local Kobe, and I go to their amazing feed, and then I look to see who they were following. And then I just like start following all the people they're following, because they're following all these like young urban farmers and young activists and stuff. And I am seeing, to an extent, some more people at least getting interested in like agriculture, younger people getting into that. And I suppose if we can just kind of push that kind of message out there about how important it is, with trees and yeah.
I think it would help. Yes. I think the more that we can sort of share information, the better.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. Okay. So I'm going to add that link. Of course, I will share that out all over my social media. And that link, that's a change.org petition. Yeah. And this one is with regards to the development you were talking about.
Yeah, in Jingogayan. And I can give you a couple other ones because the Jingogayan is not the only one. Yeah. And so there's a plan to cut about 1,000 trees in Hibiya Park in Tokyo. Really? As well as in Kasai Marine Park in the east side of Tokyo. There's a controversy in Kobe. Do you know Oji?
Oji Koen. Yeah.
So there's a whole thing where the mayor of Kobe decided we need to bring in a university branch campus. And so they got a university to build. They're going to build a branch campus where the stadium is there. Yeah, okay. Then they're going to put the stadium where the pool and the tennis courts are now. So those are going to go away. They're sort of moving everything around. Lots of trees are going to go away. Pools and tennis courts are going to go away. Local residents are not happy about it. All the public comments they did, everyone said, leave the park as it is, but that's just being ignored. There's Toyohashi Park in Aichi. They're putting a giant stadium there, and it's in a place where it doesn't even make sense to have a giant stadium because it's not really close to anything and it has it's far away from the station and it just doesn't make any sense to put a giant monstrosity there in this middle of this quiet residential neighborhood. But that's going to result in lots of trees. There are these problems like this all over. I can send you a few different petitions.
It's so interesting, this theme of governments just not doing things that make sense, right? It's just this theme across Japan and these different municipalities. And even, I guess, one of the topics, that's always a topic with me because I'm just a big nerd when it comes to tourism stuff. Because I grew up in a little tourist town in Canada. We had a national historic park in my town, and my mom and dad worked for Parks Canada their entire careers. And tourism and numbers and how to attract tourists and how to manage tourism was always a topic. We're always how can we, all the tourists just go to the national park, but they don't stop in the town. How do we get people to stop in the town and spend money in the economy there? And now with Japan, you're constantly hearing about over tourism. But when you follow the Twitter, feeds from Japan, you realize that it's only over tourism in some places and in some parts of those places. And there's so much of Japan that isn't over touristed.
And that needs people to go there.
Yeah, yes. But the people, and it seems like, and I guess I'll make that kind of comparison to Beijing again. When I lived in Beijing, they were tearing down all the hutongs and they were tearing down all of the old markets and the traditional places and building the huge Christian Dior shops and stuff like this because they wanted to show the world that, look, we're Beijing, we're an international city. And that they were doing this in hopes of attracting tourists, but they didn't seem to get was that tourists don't want to see that. Tourists wanted to see the traditional. They wanted to see the old. They wanted to see the hutongs and get that kind of vibe. And with Japan too, people don't want stadiums. People don't want treeless roads where they bake in the summers or trying to go from one shop to another.
Shopping malls. I'll give you a quote from Jorge Almazan. He's a professor at Keio, and he's written on a lot of urban planning. And he said, nobody comes to Tokyo because they want to visit Roppongi Hills.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There you go.
I think that really sums it up.
Exactly. Yeah. So, hopefully you guys out there listening, I will share some links. I will, if you can, you share those links with me, and I'll just share them out on my social media too. Even the stuff that's maybe not related to the podcast, just because this is something that I'm definitely advocating for all the time. And hopefully we can all make a little bit of a difference as we move forward. And you are making a difference, and you have. And thank you so much for your efforts and hard work in trying to keep the trees of Tokyo and elsewhere safe.
Right. Well, thanks so much. I appreciate your taking an interest, and I appreciate all the listeners you're taking an interest. And, I just feel like it's really important to speak up.
Absolutely. And also, everyone, please follow Rochelle on Twitter as well. And I'll share those links all in the show notes as well. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Great talking with you.
I want to thank Rochelle for coming on the Just Japan podcast. And of course, you can go follow her on Twitter too at Japan Intercult. So that link will be in the show notes, as well as she has also furnished me with the different various links to the different petitions and the different change.org petitions to help different parks across Tokyo. There's a Jingu Gaya one. There's one about Hibiya Park. She sent me one about Oji Park in Kobe, about Osaka, different places, and I'm going to be sharing those in the show notes. I'm also going to be sharing a lot of the stuff over on the Facebook page. So I mentioned this last week. Some of you came over to the Facebook page, and that was awesome. So if you go to facebook.com/justjapanstuff, go over there, check that out. I post a lot of things on that Facebook page. Lots of videos, photos, things from Japan, things not from Japan, but it's quite focused on the podcast. All those really important links and information will be going there as well. So go check that out. Go over there and like that Facebook page. And of course, go follow me on a couple of Instagrams. You can follow me at JlandKev. That's kind of my personal Instagram where you'll see just photos of kind of family and life here. I don't post super often. And then there's also at Japan Night Scenes on Instagram where I post. That's obviously very just exclusively Japan stuff. And there's always great content over there. So go check those links out. And thank you, Rochelle, for coming on the podcast. I hope to have you on again in the future. What's really interesting about this, I do have another podcast called the Nature Talks Podcast, which is an environmental education podcast. It's my very kind of professional-faced podcast. It's all about teaching, working with, especially with my passions of environmental and education. So for those of you who may have gotten some hints of that during this episode of the podcast, during my interview with Rochelle, I am very passionate about environmental education and connecting kids with nature and doing conservation, wildlife conservation of our local areas. So that's why I really wanted to get her on this episode to talk to her and kind of spread the word about what's going on. So if you guys didn't know about what the heck's going on with trees, now you do, and it's not good. So we need to, mobilize and do something. It's very important to do that. So that's it for another episode of this podcast. The same interview will be going into an episode of the Nature Talks podcast. There'll be a different intro and outro, of course. Very different podcast. But I think this is an important message, and I want to get it out on as many channels as I possibly can. As for me, I'm going to be continuing with my summer holiday. I'm working on a book about gardening and sustainability, having a lot of fun writing that. I'm trying to knock out 5 or 6 pages a day, but for example, today I was off for a health check for my company, so I was at the hospital all morning, and I just got back, so there will be no writing today. There'll be no writing. And as with anything, I don't know about you guys, but I always get like totally stressed out the night before a health check, even though there's probably nothing wrong with me and I feel very healthy. But I always get really stressed out. So I never sleep well the night before a health check. I went to bed at like 10 o'clock and I tossed and turned until probably like 3 in the morning. And then I had to wake up a couple of hours later to go to the hospital. So, it was also my first time going for a health screening at a hospital here in Malaysia. So I do get health screenings each and every year. Very important, guys. Preventative medicine. If you live in Japan, you have to do that too, right? Very important to get your health checks, your health screening done every year to make sure that if something isn't right, you can try to catch it early. It's very important. And then you have peace of mind if everything is okay. So, yeah. All right, guys. Well, that's it. Let's see what else is going on. I'm constantly doing research. I was just chatting behind the scenes a little bit on Twitter with Kurt Bell, looking at different websites, to check out more and learn more about IKEA, the abandoned houses that are for sale in Japan. I'm not going to be in the market to buy a house for 3 years. About 3 years, about 3 years, I'll be in the market to purchase a house in Japan. So I was asking him about his suggestions and some different people about their suggestions of ideal websites. A lot of the best real estate websites you kind of have to, that are all in English and kind of filtered and curated, you do have to pay a fee for, but I think that's going to be kind of worth it. I'm going to check out IKEAmart.com. going to do like a month of their subscription and see how I like it. And if I do like it, maybe I'll get a 1-year subscription. It's good to do the research early. It's to really have kind of a vision and an idea. I kind of have some basic geographical ideas of where I would like to purchase a property in Japan with move to with my family. But I need to kind of come up with a bit more of a solid thing. I'm also kind of looking at my life after teaching. I mean, I'm still in my 40s, guys. But guess what? I'm turning 49. This podcast will be coming out at the end of the week. So on July 20th, I turn 49 years old. Can you believe it, guys? I turned 49. So I really only have about 11 years of teaching left internationally ahead of me. And then I plan on doing the entrepreneur thing after that. So I'm working on those plans, those master plans as well. And having a property in Japan is one thing that I'll need, or maybe more than one. So that's cool. It's exciting to think about the future like that. All right, guys. Well, that's it. More on that to come. I'll probably maybe post some videos and talk about that on YouTube at Busan Kevin, or maybe on the Facebook page. Go check that out. I do post little vlogs on the Facebook page that I don't put anywhere else. The links will be below in the show notes, so go check that out, guys. Well, that's it for episode 222 of the Just Japan podcast. It's really cool, guys. I've got like all kinds of different... As I'm recording this intro and outro bumper, I've got another interview coming up tomorrow for the podcast, and then I've got another interview coming up on Saturday. So that's 3 interviews just in 1 week. For the Just Japan podcast. So it's great to have things rolling along, coming along, lots of cool things, lots of diverse topics. So it's awesome. All right, folks. Well, that's it for episode 222. Help the Just Japan podcast grow. Share us on your social medias. Give us a rating and a review. That helps. Back in the day, lots of people left ratings and reviews, but recently, not so much. This podcast came out. We were pretty much the only game in town back in the day. So, we were just crushing it with our numbers of downloads. We're doing okay now. We're doing okay. But we can always do better. We can always do better. A lot of people did leave, and now there's a lot more competition. There's just tons of podcasts about Japan now, as podcasts have become more attainable for people to record. Back when I started this podcast, it wasn't such an easy task to put one together and to upload it and host it and all that stuff. So you had to have the kind of savvy to be a host, the savviness to be a producer and get guests and wrangle guests and do interviews, but you also had to have quite a bit of tech savvy, which luckily it's more of a level playing field now. You don't need to have that tech savviness as much, so that means more people can be out there creating fantastic content. All right, it's taken me a long time to say goodbye to you guys, because I know I'm going to miss you. But I will see you next week, or at least you will hear me next week. And go check out YouTube at Busan Kevin. There will be an audio version of the podcast as well. Usually comes out a day or two after the versions here on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Amazon. All right, well, that's it. Wherever you are in the world, folks, my name's Kevin O'Shea. I'm your host. I think you guys are awesome. And be safe, be happy, be healthy, and all of that good stuff. Bye.